In the middle of a glittering ballroom, a billionaire froze. Across the crowd stood his wife, the woman he buried 7 years ago. Their eyes locked for one impossible heartbeat. Then she turned, slipping through a side door. The music pounded louder, crystal glasses clinked, but he shoved past startled guests, desperate to reach her before she disappeared into the shadows. If the dead returned to you, would you dare to follow? Victor Hale was a man who appeared to have everything. At 60, his name carried the weight of empires. A titan who had transformed a modest inheritance into a vast conglomerate that spanned industries and continents. His face often appeared on the covers of financial magazines. His presence commanded attention in boardrooms where nations and corporations sought his favor. Yet behind the iron confidence and polished charm was a man hollowed by grief, a man who returned each night to a house filled with silence. That silence had begun 7 years earlier on a rain-slick mountain road. Elena, his beloved wife, had been driving back from a charity trip when her car was found twisted and burning at the cliff's edge. By the time emergency responders arrived, flames had consumed nearly everything. The police ruled it an accident. The coroner's report, thin as paper, left no room for doubt. Victor buried what little remained in a closed casket, while flashes of cameras stormed the funeral gates. To the world, the billionaire stood stoic in his black suit. Inside, he shattered. Since that day, triumph lost its taste. Each business victory was met with indifference, every gala a hollow performance. He smiled when necessary, shook hands, signed deals, but when the photographers left, his eyes dimmed. At Hale Manor, the grand estate he had built for Elena, hallways echoed with a silence that mocked him. The garden she once tended bloomed in wild neglect. Her laughter, once a melody in those halls, had been replaced by the hum of solitude. Even at his most dazzling public appearances, Victor lived like a ghost who walked among the living. Elena had been his balance. Born to modest parents, a teacher, and a seamstress, she had grown up with little, but carried herself with warmth that disarmed everyone she met. She was nothing like the women of Victor's world, and perhaps that was why he had fallen for her. In the early days, when he worked tirelessly to prove himself, she grounded him, reminding him that there was more to life than wealth and power. She saw the man beneath the ambition, and for years, she was both his compass and his anchor. Losing her had left him untethered, a ship drifting without shore. In the years that followed her death, Victor poured himself into business. He believed work could drown sorrow, that empire could fill the hollow. Richard Kane, his oldest friend and business partner, became his constant shadow. Richard had been there from the beginning, supporting him through every major decision, and in the aftermath of Elena's passing, Richard stayed by his side, offering companionship where others offered pity. He sat with Victor on anniversaries, raised toasts in her memory, and to the world, their bond looked unbreakable. But there were others too, threads of connection that kept Victor from collapsing entirely. One of them was Anna, his young assistant. Barely in her 30s, Anna was quick, sharp, and unafraid to challenge him. She had risen through the company ranks at an unusual pace, not because of favoritism, but because she carried the kind of fire he once saw in himself. She was loyal, perhaps fiercely so, and in quiet moments, Victor admitted to himself that her resilience often reminded him of Elena. She noticed things others missed, the way his eyes lingered too long on Elena's portrait in his office, the hesitation in his voice when her name surfaced. Unlike Richard, who insisted Victor let the past rest, Anna listened without judgment. She was among the very few who cared about the man and not just the empire. Still, life had become a routine carousel: board meetings, political dinners, charity galas, Everything blurred together into a cycle of polished monotony. That was why the charity ball that night felt no different, until his world cracked. The sight of Elena had pierced through the shell he had worn for 7 years, leaving him trembling with questions that logic could not answer. Long after the gala ended, he sat in his penthouse, the city sprawling beneath him in neon light. He replayed the moment again and again, dissecting it, questioning his sanity. The exact shade of her hair, the curve of her jaw, the startled recognition in her eyes when they met his. It was not just resemblance, it was her. He had touched her coffin, stood at her grave, but none of it mattered now because, in that fleeting moment, the impossible had come alive. When dawn broke, Victor had not slept. Instead, he sifted through memories of the accident, memories he had forced himself to bury. He remembered the strangely thin report, the investigators who closed the case quickly, the lack of answers that grief had silenced in him. He had been too broken then to question, but now the cracks in that story widened like wounds. He felt something stirring in his chest he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Hope, twisted and terrifying, but hope nonetheless. And yet, with hope came fear. If Elena had lived, why had she not returned? What force could have kept her away all this time? Victor Hale wasn't a man who tolerated uncertainty. In business, ambiguity was weakness, and he had built his fortune by cutting through it with ruthless clarity. This time, however, it was not profits or markets at stake. It was his life, his truth, the woman who had once been his world. For the first time in 7 years, Victor resolved to pursue something not for his empire, not for appearances, but for himself. He would find her. The decision settled into Victor like a fire rekindled, and once it took hold, he could not sit still. He began with the accident report, requesting copies from the authorities, but doors closed quickly. Clerks claimed the files had been archived elsewhere. Some insisted they had been sealed. Others claimed they had been misplaced entirely. For a man used to compliance at the snap of his fingers, this resistance was jarring. He pushed harder, but the harder he pressed, the more evasive the responses became. It was not oversight, it was deliberate. He turned to Richard, the man who had stood by him through every storm. When Victor told him about the woman at the gala, Richard's eyes hardened almost imperceptibly before softening with practiced sympathy. He reminded Victor of his grief, of the tricks memory could play, urging him not to tear open wounds that had barely healed. The words were kind, but the way he delivered them left a splinter in Victor's mind. Richard, usually relentless in helping him chase answers, now wanted him to stop. It was a shift too sharp to ignore. Anna, however, was different. When Victor shared what he had seen, her gaze did not waver. She asked questions instead, probing details of the woman's appearance, the timing, the place. When he admitted the police files seemed incomplete, she offered to dig further. It was Anna who first suggested visiting the coroner's office, and it was Anna who raised the possibility that perhaps the accident had been staged. Victor resisted at first, unwilling to let such a dangerous thought take root, but the logic was undeniable. If Elena had truly died that night, why was the evidence so thin? The coroner's office proved no less obstructive. Records had been transferred, they claimed, and no one could say where. Victor pressed harder, only to be met with silence and polite refusals. He left with nothing but the gnawing certainty that someone was hiding the truth. That night, returning to Hale Manor, he noticed the garden gate ajar. His estate was always meticulously secure, yet the latch swung loose in the wind. Stepping inside, he found the lights flickering oddly in the hallway, a subtle disturbance in a house that usually ran like a machine. On his desk lay an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single photograph. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Elena, stepping out of a car, her head lowered, her hair tied back. The date scrawled in the corner marked only 3 months earlier. Victor's chest constricted as he stared at the picture, his pulse roaring in his ears. Proof. She was alive. But as the initial rush of hope surged through him, dread followed swiftly behind. Whoever had left the photograph wanted him to know, and if they could place it on his desk, inside his home, then they also wanted him to understand how closely he was being watched. Sleep was impossible that night. Victor sat in his study until dawn, the photograph trembling in his hand, his thoughts racing in circles. Every instinct honed by decades of navigating ruthless boardrooms told him the same thing. This was not chance. Someone had taken her from him. Someone had erased the truth and was still pulling strings. He thought of Richard's sudden insistence to let it go, of the sealed files, of the eyes he had felt on him as he left the coroner's office. By morning, one truth burned clear. This was no illusion of grief. It was not the mind playing cruel tricks. Someone had stolen his wife from him, and someone wanted him to stay silent. But Victor Hale was not a man who bowed to intimidation. He had built his empire by staring into the eyes of adversaries and never blinking. This time would be no different, except the stakes were far higher. It was not about money or power. It was about Elena. The conflict had revealed itself, and though Victor did not yet see its full shape, he knew this was the beginning of a battle that would strip away the lies laid over his life. Somewhere behind the walls of power he had trusted, an enemy was waiting, and Victor's first step toward the truth had already set the storm in motion. Victor had lived through battles of hostile takeovers and political storms that could ruin nations, but nothing compared to the storm that now brewed inside him. The photograph of Elena was not just a spark of hope. It was a fuse burning toward an explosion. He began moving quietly, concealing his suspicions even from those closest to him, knowing instinctively that the enemy might be nearer than he wished to believe. He hired a private investigator, a man with no ties to his company, someone whose loyalty could be bought only with money and discretion. Within days, the investigator returned with whispers, fragments of sightings, and names of clinics hidden in plain sight across the city. One stood out, a small private facility on the outskirts, known for its unusual discretion. Patients admitted there often left no trace in official records. When Victor pressed for more, the investigator hesitated, admitting that files connected to the clinic had been pulled by someone with authority far greater than his own. Meanwhile, his relationship with Richard began to strain. At board meetings, Richard pressed him to focus on a new acquisition, chiding him for his distraction. Victor concealed his growing suspicion behind a mask of calm, but in his chest, unease curdled into anger. Richard had been his brother in everything but blood, yet now his reassurances rang hollow. One evening, Victor tested him. He placed the photograph of Elena on the desk between them and watched. Richard's reaction was swift, a flicker of alarm masked by laughter. He dismissed it as a cruel forgery, a trick to exploit Victor's grief. But the way Richard avoided his gaze told Victor more than words ever could. Anna remained his only anchor. When he showed her the photograph, her face drained of color, but she did not call it impossible. Instead, she whispered that if Elena was alive, someone had gone to great lengths to keep her hidden. Together, they began piecing fragments, tracking financial records and property holdings tied not to Victor himself, but to shell companies connected through Richard's signature. The deeper they dug, the more resistance rose. Servers crashed inexplicably when Anna attempted to access records. Meetings were interrupted by subtle threats, veiled comments from politicians about the dangers of chasing ghosts. One night, Anna's car was forced off the road by a black SUV. She survived with shaken nerves, but the message was clear. Someone knew they were close, and someone was determined to stop them. Victor's first attempt to confront the truth ended in failure. He arranged to visit the private clinic identified by the investigator. Upon arrival, he found the building locked, its windows dark, its staff evacuated hours earlier. Records were gone, shredded or burned. He walked through rooms stripped bare, walls echoing with absence, until he reached a chamber still reeking faintly of antiseptic. On the floor lay a single bracelet. It was delicate, silver, engraved with the letter E. He had given it to Elena on their 10th anniversary. The bracelet trembled in his hand as rage welled inside him. Whoever had taken her had not just hidden her, they had erased her life piece by piece. For the first time in years, Victor felt powerless, his empire meaningless against shadows that could move faster than his reach. He left the clinic with failure pressed into his chest like a stone, knowing he had been outmaneuvered. But even in failure, the enemy revealed itself. Victor returned home to find a letter waiting on his desk. No signature, just a single sentence in sharp handwriting. Stop searching, or you will lose more than your wife. The words sliced into him, a threat not only to Elena but to everything he still held. The weight of the empire, his fortune, even his own life seemed secondary now. For a man who had already lost everything once, the threat was meaningless. Instead, it hardened his resolve. Then came the micro twist, small but sharp, that shifted the game once more. Late one night, Anna uncovered a hidden account funneling millions through layers of fronts. At the center was not an unfamiliar name, but Richard Kane, the man Victor had trusted above all others. The one who had walked beside him in grief had been pulling the strings behind the curtain. The revelation struck like betrayal etched in fire. It was not yet the full picture, but it was enough to confirm the growing dread inside him. Richard was not the ally he pretended to be. Victor stood at the window of his penthouse, the city burning with lights beneath him, the bracelet of Elena tight in his fist. He knew now that he was facing not chance, not illusion, but deliberate cruelty from the very man he had called brother. The enemy was no longer a shadow. It had a name, a face, and it was closer than he had ever imagined. The storm had risen, and there was no turning back. The discovery gnawed at Victor like a poison he could not purge. Richard's name, attached to hidden accounts and shadow companies, was no coincidence. The man who had once lifted him through storms had been orchestrating lies behind his back. Still, Victor needed proof beyond the whisper of numbers. Betrayal demanded clarity, and he was determined to drag it into the light. Anna pressed him to act cautiously. She reminded him that Richard held not only influence within the company, but also deep connections in politics and law enforcement. If Richard was involved, then the web of deceit was far wider than Victor had imagined. The thin accident report, the sealed files, the vanishing records from the clinic, all of it suddenly pointed in one direction. But the more Victor thought of it, the more unbearable the silence became. He needed to see Elena with his own eyes. Days later, his chance arrived. A tip from the investigator led him to an estate outside the city, discreetly purchased under one of Richard's shells. Victor arrived at night, slipping past the perimeter with a pounding heart. Inside, he moved through dim corridors, the silence broken only by the creak of old wood. He pushed open a door, and there she was. Elena sat on a narrow bed, thinner than he remembered, her face pale under the dim light. For a moment, time collapsed, and Victor forgot the years between. He whispered her name, his voice breaking. Her eyes widened, trembling as if she too could not believe the man before her. When he reached for her, she recoiled, clutching her arms as though afraid. It was not the reunion he had dreamed of. Elena's voice cracked as she pleaded with him to leave. She told him he was in danger, that those holding her would not hesitate to destroy him if he continued. Victor tried to assure her that he could protect them both, but she shook her head violently. Then she whispered the words that froze him in place. "Richard knows everything. He was there the night of the accident. He made me disappear." The confession struck with the force of a blade. Elena had not only survived, she had been kept captive by the very man Victor trusted most. Before he could ask more, footsteps thundered in the hallway. The door burst open, and men flooded the room. Victor was dragged away as Elena screamed, her cries echoing down the corridor. He fought, but the grip of the guards was iron. Thrown out into the night, bruised and breathless, Victor realized the truth had only partly emerged. Richard was indeed behind the curtain, but the depth of his betrayal, the reasons for Elena's captivity, remained locked in shadow. What he had just witnessed proved that Elena was alive. Yet it also showed how powerful his enemy had become. For the first time, Victor understood that this was no longer a search for answers. It was a war. The night after Elena was torn from his reach, Victor sat in his study with the bracelet pressed against his palm, the weight of her whispered words anchoring him in rage. Richard knew everything. Richard had made her disappear. For years, Victor had leaned on the man he called brother, trusted him with secrets, wealth, even his grief. Now that mask had fallen, and beneath it lay the architect of his torment. The next days were a blur of calculations. Victor moved in silence, masking his fury behind routine, attending meetings with the same stoic presence, while his mind wove threads together. He replayed every moment with Richard, the offers of comfort, the insistence to let the past rest, the careful diversions whenever questions rose. Each recollection became evidence, each memory another nail in the coffin of trust. But Victor understood that anger alone would not save Elena. He had spent his life dismantling adversaries who thought themselves untouchable. And this time, he would use the same ruthless precision. Anna stood at his side, her loyalty unshaken. Together they traced Richard's empire of shell companies, uncovering properties and accounts tied to politicians, security firms, and even the police. Richard's influence had woven a net that seemed impenetrable. Yet even the strongest nets fray under the right pressure. Victor devised a plan not to confront Richard head-on, but to collapse the world he had built around himself. He began by leaking fragments of evidence anonymously to journalists hungry for scandal. Bank records, falsified contracts, whispers of illegal transactions, all carefully chosen to point to Richard without revealing Victor's hand. At the same time, Anna worked tirelessly to secure allies in unexpected places, convincing a disillusioned board member to share documents, persuading a low-ranking officer to pass along files thought long buried. Each piece of information drew Richard's empire closer to the brink. The confrontation came sooner than Victor expected. Richard summoned him to the company's private retreat, a glass fortress overlooking the ocean. The air between them crackled with unspoken knowledge. Richard poured 2 glasses of whiskey, his smile calm, but his eyes sharp as blades. He spoke of loyalty, of friendship, of the danger of digging into graves best left untouched. Then he leaned forward and admitted what Victor already knew. Elena had lived. Richard had staged the accident, arranging the fire, silencing investigators, sealing files. He had kept her alive not out of mercy, but out of calculation. She was leverage, a chain around Victor's neck, a way to ensure the empire stayed under Richard's quiet control. The revelation seared through Victor, but he did not falter. He let Richard believe he still held power, listened as he justified betrayal with claims of protecting the company, of shielding Victor from enemies who would have destroyed them both. But behind his composed mask, Victor's fury crystallized into resolve. That night, with the waves crashing below, the 2 men faced each other, not as partners, but as adversaries. Richard offered a final warning, promising that Elena would vanish forever if Victor pushed further. Victor met his gaze with a calm that unsettled the man who thought he knew him best. Then Victor spoke, his voice low but unyielding, telling Richard that the empire he had built would crumble on his own head. In the days that followed, Victor's plan struck with precision. Journalists released damning reports, regulators announced investigations, allies once loyal to Richard turned away. One by one, the pillars that upheld his power collapsed. With every revelation, Richard's defenses weakened. Finally, law enforcement raided one of the hidden estates, and in its cold basement, they found Elena. Fragile, trembling, but alive. Victor was there when the doors burst open. The moment he saw her, the years of grief, suspicion, and rage dissolved into relief so raw it left him unsteady. He took her into his arms, promising she would never be taken from him again. Elena clung to him, whispering that she had endured because she believed one day he would find her. Richard, meanwhile, was dragged into the storm of his own making. His empire shattered, his name smeared across headlines, his allies abandoning him in disgrace. He had played his game too long, believing himself invincible, but now he faced the consequence of betrayal. For Victor, the twist was not just the unveiling of Richard's treachery, but the reclamation of the love he thought lost forever. He had walked through fire, deception, and betrayal, and though scarred, he emerged with Elena beside him. The war was not without cost, but for the first time in years, he felt whole. The trial that followed was swift and merciless. The mountain of evidence Victor and Anna had unleashed left Richard no room to maneuver. Former allies testified against him. Prosecutors pieced together the empire of deceit, and the press devoured every revelation with ravenous hunger. For years, Richard had hidden in the shadow of loyalty, but now the light of truth burned away his facade, exposing him as a man who had traded friendship for control and compassion for greed. Victor did not attend every session of the trial. Instead, he spent those days with Elena, helping her piece together fragments of a life stolen from her. She was frail at first, struggling to walk the gardens of Hale Manor without glancing over her shoulder. But with each passing week, her strength returned. She relearned freedom like a bird stepping out of a cage, tentative but determined. For Victor, watching her reclaim her life was more satisfying than any verdict a court could hand down. Yet the day Richard was sentenced, Victor stood in the courtroom. Their eyes met one last time across the chamber. Richard, once the man he had trusted most, now stood in shackles, his face pale, his arrogance stripped away. He tried to speak, to offer excuses, or perhaps to beg for understanding. But Victor did not listen. He turned away before the words could form, leaving Richard to the silence of justice. Outside the courthouse, the world clamored for Victor's reaction, reporters shouting questions about betrayal, redemption, and revenge. He gave them nothing more than a measured glance and a single sentence. The truth always rises. Then he guided Elena into the waiting car, shielding her from the chaos. In the months that followed, Hale Industries endured turbulence, but ultimately stabilized. Investors regained confidence when Victor reaffirmed his leadership, this time with Anna elevated to a position of trust beside him. The empire had been scarred, but not broken, and through the ashes of betrayal, it emerged stronger, tempered by the fire it had endured. As for Victor and Elena, they found solace not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments. Walking hand in hand through the gardens, sharing breakfast without the weight of secrets, simply existing together again. The hollow silence that had haunted Hale Manor slowly lifted, replaced by laughter, that had once been its heartbeat. The consequences for Richard were final. Stripped of power, condemned to years behind bars. His name became a cautionary tale, whispered in the same boardrooms where it had once commanded respect. For Victor, that was enough. Justice had been served, not by vengeance, but by truth revealed in its entirety. And in that truth, Victor discovered something greater than victory. He had regained not only the woman he thought lost forever, but also the certainty that love, no matter how deeply buried beneath lies, could still be reclaimed. Victor often found himself wandering the halls of Hale Manor late at night, the very halls that once mocked him with silence. Now they carried echoes of life again, footsteps that did not belong only to him. Soft laughter carried down from the garden where Elena tended roses once more. There were scars that time could not erase, memories of fire and betrayal. But he understood now that scars were not only marks of pain, they were proof of survival. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and painted the estate in gold, Victor stood beside Elena on the terrace. She leaned into him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. For a long while they said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The world had tried to bury them under lies, yet here they stood, side by side, breathing the same air, sharing the same horizon. Victor thought of Richard, of the years wasted in trust misplaced, and he felt no triumph in his fall. What he felt instead was clarity. Wealth, power, the empire he had fought to preserve, none of it had ever mattered compared to this moment. The true empire was not built of steel or contracts, but of love, loyalty, and truth. Those were the foundations that endured. When Elena turned to him and asked softly if he ever regretted searching, Victor only smiled. Without the search, he said, he would still be living as half a man. Without the search, he would never have found her again. His voice trembled not with weakness, but with gratitude. Then he looked out across the fading light and asked her a question that had lingered since the night he first saw her in the crowd. If the one you loved appeared before you after years of believing them gone, would you have the courage to follow, even into the unknown? Now I want to ask you the same. If you saw the face of someone you lost forever, suddenly alive in front of you, would you take that step into the dark, not knowing what truth awaited on the other side? Tell me, what would you do?